everybody. My name is Dr. Tal Nitzan. I am the academic coordinator for the Sophie Davis Forum, which is located within the Leonard Davis Institute for International Studies here at Hebrew University. What we're going to do today is a workshop with Professor Chris Dolan. Do you want me to introduce you? Do you want to introduce yourself?
You can try.
I can try.
see what you know about.
Chris Dolan is a professor now. You going to join us?
Yeah.
Please do. Chris Dolan is a recent appointment as of this academic year at the School for Cross-Faculty Studies in the University of Warwick. This appointment came after about 2 decades of him working in sub-Saharan Africa. He was working for 16 years, he worked as the director of the Refugee Law Project in Uganda from 2006 until recently in 2022. And he led the development of work with male survivors of conflict-related sexual violence and raised awareness globally of the need to expand understanding of the forms, targets, and impacts of such violence. Today he's going to talk about gendering wartime sexual violence and its impacts. And we did not add the word impact for nothing, because it's really important to both understand sexual violence in wartime, to understand the gender dimension of it, and to understand the impacts of the relations and of all the above. So I am going to leave you in the very capable hands of Professor Christopher Dolan, and sit down.
Thank you, Tal. Good morning, everybody. It seems I've met some of you before. In my previous role, as Tal mentioned, I worked most of my career to date was in sub-Saharan Africa, in South Africa, Mozambique, and Congo, but the largest chunk was in Uganda in my previous role as director of an organization called Refugee Law Project, which was what they called an outreach project of the School of Law in Makerere University, which is the main government university, or until recently was the main government university in Uganda. Now there are several additional ones. And I was in that role for 16 years. That's the role in which I developed most of what I'm going to talk about today. And I stepped down at the end of April, mainly in the hope that I can teach more and write more, because running the actual organization, although it was necessary in terms of the kind of work I'm talking about, to be able to try it out and model it, it also involved running the show and not having very much time to sit and think. So you see me now with my new hat, trying to capture some of what we learned over those years. So what I think we're hoping for today is to create a space in which we can talk about what is really often not discussed at all, or very little, namely sexual violence against men and its impacts. And I should say right from the beginning, if you had talked to me, or if I had talked to you, with you 10 years ago, my focus would just simply have been to say, it's happening, this is what it looks like, in terms of what happens to men. What I want to do now, and I'll explain, the presentation is really about how I've gone from that to looking at not just the victims that we occasionally see, but also the many others that are connected to them. That's what I hope by the time we leave at the end of this workshop, you'll leave not thinking, oh yeah, I need to add men into my understanding of sexual violence, but also what does adding in men mean more broadly for the discussion about sexual violence in conflict. As Tal outlined, presentation, discussion, first 45 minutes or so. Then there's a film which we haven't officially launched. Somebody was looking for it online last night. Unfortunately, they couldn't find it because we haven't launched it yet. So you're getting a bit of a sneak preview of this film. Then, if you allow, we'll split you into a couple of groups to just sort of talk through what does that film really say to you. Then we have a bit of a lunch break and come back, and I'm looking for your feedback on the film as well, because we're still in a space where we could slightly modify it if that seemed appropriate. I should say I've been caught out several times because I've been working on this for so long that I no longer think about the shock value that it can have as a topic. It's not always very comfortable. Descriptions of sexual violence, other gender harms can be quite difficult to listen to. There will almost certainly be people in the room who've had their own experiences of abuse, sexual violence, intimate partner violence, and so on, all of which somehow connect in to what we're talking about today. So if it does trigger you, I used to use a lot of visual images at the time when I was still trying to persuade people that this is actually something real. These days I've kind of cut down on those images because I've had people complaining too much.
Too real.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think for today probably I could have kept them in because you came here by choice. When I'm now teaching at the university, the students didn't come there knowing that they were going to get a talk about sexual violence, so I have to be much more careful. But anyway, it's reminded me to put in this trigger warning. I should also...
Open the door. We have a lack of air.
Oh, I can open this one. Is that okay? Yeah. I should also say I'm talking specifically about my work in East Africa, so I'm not going to try and make any generalizations. That's for you to decide what you think is generalizable to other contexts or not. But having said East Africa, the men that I've worked with and their families are coming from all over the place because we were the refugee law project, so we had refugees from all the neighboring countries. I also did a lot of work with internally displaced people from northern Uganda. Yeah. So just by way of a starter, this is a picture from yesterday. I went on a very interesting guided tour of Old Jerusalem. And somewhere on the walls in the Armenian quarter, I found this slightly shredded poster about the Armenian genocide. And among the many interesting things was the line, the Turkish authorities also carried out deliberate starvation of the deportees, systematic something or other. And the important bit, the government sanctioned rape of men, women and children. Now, I put a question mark there. Why is that an interesting statement?
Because usually it would be women and children, officially.
Absolutely.
Quite rare to see men.
Definitely in the front, right?
Right.
You also see it 100 years ago.
Sorry?
Also to see it from 100 years ago.
Yeah, exactly, 100 years ago. And but the critical issue is, as you've just said, I can safely say I have never seen it presented like that. Never. And I've been working on it for decades. So
These have been for a while. These posters for years.
I'm sure, but I've never been to Jerusalem before.
You have to come here.
Yeah.
I mean, more than I think 20 years. There
Right.
are these posters even more.
The same poster with the same text. Yeah.
Dolan was the one who suggested Chava as your.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I apologize. I couldn't do it myself. She's a colleague. She's an excellent guy.
Yeah, it was really fantastic, I must say. But anyway, I had to come to Jerusalem to see this for the first time as a text that's kind of out there in the public, and which doesn't put, not just doesn't put women and children first, but mentions men at all in a public kind of statement. So it's pretty interesting. As you said, I mean, normally you'd expect things like rape of women as a weapon of war, sexual victimization of women and children, and there would be no mention of men. I was thinking this morning as I was preparing these slides, like, do I put of women in brackets? And I'm like, no, because if you put it in brackets, then you're drawing attention to the fact that it's of women rather than of men, whereas the statements never do that. It's just the rape of women, and we take that as the given, but we're supposed to wrap our heads around. Oh my God, I forgot all about the introductions. Yeah, let's do it before this. Yeah, good point. Can I ask, as we introduce, I'm really sorry, time's running, but I did actually want to hear from you, not only who you are, but also what your engagement is with this topic, if any, because it makes for a more useful discussion if I have a sense of quite a lot of different bits of knowledge about the issue. So let's see whether we can pull it together a bit in this session. Peru is actually an interesting example. There was a very interesting study done where somebody recoded the transcripts from the Truth Commission in Peru, and the level of sexual violence against men, just from recoding, looking at the language and recoding it, it went from something like 4%, I think, up to about 23%. So language is really important, what language we use, what terminology we use. A couple of people have mentioned torture. If any man tells you he's been tortured, you need to probe. What form did that torture take? Which part of your body was tackled? Because an awful lot of what I think of as sexual violence against men traditionally has been kind of disappeared under the rubric of torture. So we kind of got to the point before the introductions about the usual messaging. And of course the usual messaging is not an accident. It's very much sort of structured into all sorts of different places, starting with the law as a useful place to examine. I'm not a lawyer, but I was forced to look at this many times. And I'm just giving the example of Uganda, but I don't know the situation here in Israel. But Uganda is just like pretty much every other country that was colonized by the British. The British wrote the penal code. It's had very little revision since. And the provisions are pretty much the same if you go and look at the penal code in other former colonies like Tanzania. I'm not sure about Kenya. I can't remember reading the Kenyan penal code. But it's nearly always pretty much the same language. So in the Ugandan case, defines rape as any person who has unlawful carnal knowledge of a woman or a girl.
It's the same in Israel.
Without her consent, right? And so you have a problem right there. There's no provision for the rape of men in that definition. You have the unnatural offences further down the penal code, which talk about any person who has carnal knowledge of any person against the order of nature. The order of nature is just this sort of normative assumption that the only natural form of penetration is penis to vagina. So carnal knowledge against the order of nature is if the penis goes any other place. Has carnal knowledge of an animal, or permits a male person to have carnal knowledge of him or her against the order of nature. So right there, even the permit, there's no framework for not permitting. There's no language for the person who doesn't permit it. So you have a legal framework in Uganda and all these other places which actually potentially could criminalize the victim, and which then in turn means that people won't talk about it because they don't want to take the risk of being criminalized. And once again we have a silencing. So right from the criminal codes in different countries, we can see the problem beginning. If you study the Rome Statute definition, it's very, very different and worthy of that paragraph. I think is worth quite a bit of attention. Defines rape as the perpetrator invaded the body of a person, so not of a man or a woman, but of a person. So it's gender neutral in that sense. By conduct resulting in penetration, however slight, of any part of the body of the victim or of the perpetrator. So women can rape men, but also if the victim penetrates the perpetrator, I mean, so that it could be a man who has to penetrate his perpetrator with a sexual organ, so any part of the body. So that includes the mouth, it could be the ears, all sorts of different places, with a sexual organ or of the anal or genital opening of the victim with any object. So rape with objects is quite a thing actually, particularly against men. Not everywhere has a force of homosexual men that are assumed to be able to get it up enough to penetrate. So the rape with objects is a useful substitute if that's what you're trying to do, or any other part of the body. So you can see there's a lot of different scenarios envisaged in this one very complex paragraph, and it bears rereading several times, and I have done that because it is so different from the conventional definitions. And then you have the language around.
A comment about the use of the term, I mean, saying that there is a group of homosexual men. I don't think their sexual identity is relevant. They are. It's not them being homosexual. Is not, has nothing to do with them raping other men. I just want to make this.
No,
I'm picking up on what was said.
I'm not referring to any person here. I'm just saying that I am uncomfortable with this.
I picked up on it because so that we could bring this to the surface, because.
But it has nothing to do with their sexual tendency or identity of these men, right? What they do.
But I think that in the case that you described, there's a belief that it is.
That's different. Russia is they start a huge homophobic campaign. So, and if they are really retranslate publicly the victims and the episodes of raping of Ukrainian soldiers by these, let me say, homosexual prisoners, and it's a form of additional humiliation in understanding of Russians. So that's not because of their sexuality. That's a point of manipulation of social appearance, of social meaning, and manipulation of the stereotypes they have. So that's not because of their sexuality.
But in fact, the supposedly homosexual penetrators are themselves victims because they're detainees being made to penetrate other detainees. Yeah.
By the way, the consultant of the Jerusalem police for Arab affairs is a well-known investigator that was actually accused and indicted for penetrating a Lebanese prisoner with a stick. This is well-known in Israel. I guess some Israelis know what I'm talking about. And he's now working as a consultant for the Jerusalem police. So everyone knows
his work.
His code name.
And in prison hierarchy, in Russian prison hierarchy, this group of these people, they are like in casta of untouchables. They called pituhi. So that is why it's like additional form of social downgrade to people who act with them in any kind of sexual communication. So that the stuff, that's the main idea. So that's about more humiliation, and that's about more of undermining the will of soldiers, according to this hierarchy, prison hierarchy.
It's really important, yeah. And I mean, I think one of the biggest issues in this whole topic, actually, and especially for survivors, is where do the erections come from?
Yeah.
You know, and is it to do with sexual orientation, or is it something else? And I mean, in many cases, it's something else. It's not about the person's underlying sexual orientation, attraction at all. It's one of the most interesting things and disturbing things is how the male body can be weaponized, if you like, to borrow a term. And people can be brought to physical arousal in the sense that they're erect enough to be able to penetrate somebody else, even though it's hard to imagine how they can possibly be doing that given the circumstances. But it's a fear response rather than a kind of sexual, erotic arousal response. And I've talked to enough men who've been put into that kind of scenario, and it's utterly destructive.
Yeah.
I mean, the men I know who have been forced to penetrate other people under duress or under threat of being killed if they don't do it, they're the most disrupted people I've ever talked with. So penetration does not equal enjoyment. It doesn't give you a reading of that person's normal sexual orientation under sexual orientation under normal circumstances. You're about to add?
No, it's not easy for me to hear this discussion. I'm not used to this. So
Yeah.
Disturbed, but I have nothing to say.
So in terms of my own sort of journey towards being able to, I describe it as being able to hear and see conflict-related sexual violence against men. When I try to think back, where did I first hear about it? It was around 1996 when I was interviewing ex-combatants, and out of the hundreds that we interviewed, there was one guy who insisted on coming and talking to us after the interview. And what he wanted to tell us about was how he had witnessed, not done, but witnessed enemy soldiers having their genitals cut off and put into their mouths after they were killed. And that was what he needed to tell us about, kind of 9 o'clock at night. And of course it stuck in my head because it was a very disturbing discussion. But like everybody else, I also had zero training in how to ask about the broader issue of sexual violence, and we were not asking about it. Now I look back and I wish, my God, we interviewed 800 ex-combatants. There were probably several hundred cases we could have identified if we had only asked the right questions. But we didn't ask and nobody told us. Jumping forward into northern Uganda, for people who don't know much about Uganda, apart from Idi Amin and what was the
Uganda plan.
The Uganda plan. But there have been other conflicts in Uganda. In fact, the whole country has been riven by conflicts ever since independence. But the largest one is it's called the Lord's Resistance Army, LRA, Joseph Kony. Some of you know an awful lot about this. That was a situation. Sometimes I don't even know whether to define it as a war, but a situation that went on roughly from 1986, when the current regime came to power, until 2006, when there was a quasi-peace accord, and the LRA disappeared off into Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, and then they went up into Chad. So they're still there, but they're not present in northern Uganda. But 1998, 1999, the situation was still on the rise. There was at that point, 300,000 or 400,000 internally displaced people. It went up to at least 2 million by the early 2000s. And I was doing research about the war in general and how people were dealing with it at a local level. That was my research topic. So I was interviewing all sorts of people, and even I didn't really have a question except like what's going on and how is it impacting you. And people would tell me many, many things. And then when I switched off the tape recorder, pre-digital, switched off the tape recorder, you get out, bye-bye, thanks very much. And then people say, but there's something else I want to tell you about. Our men are being raped. So it was kind of this big secret that people would not talk about in public at all. But I don't know why they decided to trust me to tell me about it, but it happened again and again and again and again. That was back in 1998, 99. Again, I wasn't really ready to kind of really hear it properly and explore it on the spot. But it definitely registered in my mind that this is an issue that needs more attention, and I came back to it. And about 10 years later, we managed to do a film called Gender Against Men, where we got one individual on camera talking about his experience. All blurred, you couldn't identify him. But it had taken years to get to that point. That film then triggered one of our colleagues at some point to say, oh, I know some other men that happened to. And one of them was willing to go on camera and show his face. He wanted to show his face. It was a political thing. Like, this is, I'm now of an age where I need to say this so that other people that it happens to don't feel so blocked from talking about it. So he talked about it by the time he talked about it, he was in his late 70s. He's now in his late 80s. He's still alive, but he talked about it in his late 70s, 25 years after it had happened. So those were two kind of fairly critical moments in terms of raising the temperature of the discussion. And around the same time as that guy came and talked with us, I was getting more and more individual men coming to me and saying, often after a very long time, but they would tell me eventually that they'd been victims of sexual violence. And so we asked people, once we had a number of individuals, we talked to them individually and said, are you interested in meeting with other men that have been through similar experiences? And when we had 3 who said yes, we put them together and they established a group. And that group is still going strong. It now has over 300 members. And we established similar groups in other areas. You'll know some of the refugee settlements, like Nakivali, and some of the ones in the north, near Adjumani, and so on. So it's just sort of come more and more of an issue as we went along. And we had to establish particular programming to try and address their needs more directly. And we also created platforms for people to speak. So if you do go online and look at Refugee Law Project, the video advocacy documentaries, there are many items which capture survivors' voices and perspectives. In the process, my sort of journey is to go from rape and torture as these kind of two catch-all terms, and identifying this kind of ever expanding list of different forms of sexual, what I would call sexual violence. Rape obviously is there. We looked at the definition just now. We've mentioned the force to witness. So many accounts, especially from Congo, of armed men they're coming into the home and then obliging the men in the home to just literally forcing them to watch their own children, their wives, their parents, etc., being raped. Forced masturbation, again, just like you wonder, like, how can you penetrate when you're when somebody's holding a gun to your head, well, apparently you can. You'd wonder, how can you possibly masturbate to the point of ejaculation when somebody's holding a gun to your head? But people have done it. But often it's very damaging as well, depending on how you're asked to do it. It could, we've had cases of people being forced to masturbate themselves in a hole in the ground or a hole in a banana tree, and all sorts of horrendous scenarios in which the genitals obviously get very damaged as well. Forced penetration, we talked about, children, parents, your own siblings, your fellow detainees. I think we've had the example from that you gave us. Lots of forced nudity. Again, there's this sort of assumption that this only is uncomfortable for women, but it's extremely problematic for men as well. Endless, I mean, this is just a summary list of genital harms. Tying of the testicles, blocking the blood flow for long enough that they start to atrophy. Cutting, various forms of cutting, up to castration. Kenya, classic example, post-election violence, lots of cutting and some castration. Burning with cigarettes and other instruments. Crushing. I once reviewed a series of testimonies from Sri Lanka, so from a different part of the world, but where they would slam the testicles in a drawer. So there are lots of different ways in which that's got done. I could go on and on with examples here. Biting. There's a case in, I think it's Kunarac in ICTY, the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, where detainees were forced to bite each other's testicles off. Landmines we don't think of as sexual violence, but landmines that explode and destroy your genitals, from a victim point of view, is sexual violence, because your whole sexuality is impacted and often just gone. Gunshots, that's actually from the Syrian, there's one of those commissions on Syria, which has documented lots of literally snipers targeting people in residential apartments through the window, that kind of thing. Forced bestiality, remember, acts against the order of nature, including with animals. So there are definitely instances of that. And sexual slavery. So I've interacted with quite a number of men that were used, not once for the purposes of direct humiliation, but for sexual gratification, again and again and again. I remember one guy who was detained in Rwanda post-genocide, and he got passed from one prison guard to another. So you'd have a prison guard who used him for a while, then the prison guard got transferred somewhere else, but he handed him over to another prison guard who continued to use him on a regular basis.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
What about forced cannibalism of the genital? Because I could see in testimonies that there is a specific interest in the inner organs of the woman. Do you familiar with that same phenomenon in men?
I can't think of any, I've not heard that personally, no. I would be surprised if it's not there. I mean, it's a matter of, have I listened to somebody telling me about that? No.
Yeah.
And my colleagues haven't told me about it.
Cannibalism is very famous in the order. It's an expression of owning the victim.
Yeah.
So everything that is written there is obviously making them a victim, and it pops up that it's not there, the cannibalism part.
But I would expect it should be there.
Yeah.
I'm putting down ones that I've heard about directly myself, but I haven't come across that. But as I say, it's also about, are we asking the right questions? So I don't think we've ever put a question to people about cannibalism, particularly specifically of the genitalia.
The one thing I can think of is it's very common, and I've seen it in other settings, and you mention it, is the part where they cut male penises and they put them in their own mouth.
Yeah.
and that's reoccurring in many conflicts,
Yeah.
and sometimes it happens with men, and sometimes men are forced to rape women, and then the women have the penis sewed in there. There's a lot of fun things like that happening.
And I mean, don't try and write down the statistics, but it's the same list basically. There are a couple extra here that I didn't put on that list, but being forced into survival sex, being forced into marriage. I mean, the big instance of that we're all is well known about now, but very belatedly is in Cambodia and the Khmer Rouge, and the fact that wasn't tackled by the extraordinary chambers for a long time. All the others, I think I've touched on, but unwanted sexual touching is actually surprisingly high. Being used as a mattress, this is a very sort of, I don't know whether it's region specific, but you get it a lot it was in northern Uganda and sometimes South Sudan as well, where you get the man who's on the floor, then the woman is put on top, and then the rapist is on top of the woman. So the husband is literally lying underneath while everything else goes on above him.
Mattress, being used as a mattress.
Being used as a mattress. Briefly on the impacts, I tend to summarize them just as the 5 Ps, just to kind of give it a bit of a shape. Obviously you get lots of physical impacts, some of which disappear relatively fast, some of which last for ages if they're not treated at the right time. So I'm not going to read the whole list, it's quite extensive. Certainly the doctors that we work with, they repeatedly implore us, like, can you bring these guys earlier? Because it will be so much, there are so many complications that come out of it not being treated on time. And if you could treat it on time, a lot of this would be much less of an issue. Then there's the psychological, the humiliation, self-esteem issues, depression, anxiety, insomnia, anger. If you're in a counseling role and you get an angry man opposite you, you have to really ask yourself, what is this anger? Where is it coming from? Because certainly when we were first working with men, often the presentation was just, they were just so angry and they were kind of looking at you like, and you're like, what have I done? And then you'd realize actually the anger's got nothing to do with me. That is how they're projecting their emotional state. They're not allowed to cry, so they show anger instead. So anger is very important. And that's a real issue, and especially we had a real issue with women counsellors who felt very intimidated by these apparently very angry men. And we had to really kind of think it through and talk it through. And it became much less of the anger as a presentation was still there, but how people perceived it and reacted to it changed quite a bit. Withdrawal, identity crises, suicidal ideation. When I first started looking at this in northern Uganda, one of my colleagues who'd been working on sexual violence for quite a number of years, and she was from the area, I asked her, where are the men? And she said, well, most of them are gone, they committed suicide. Like the women tell us about them, when we go and try and find them, they're no longer there because they've actually done away with themselves. So suicidal ideation is not just an ideation, it's quite often an actual achieved act. Psychosexual is a massive issue. I don't think I've talked to a survivor that has not described in one way or another, all of these different, what I would call psychosexual impacts. Impotence, loss of sexual interest, disgust at the thought of any kind of sexual activity, identity anxieties, especially, oh my God, am I now homosexual? That's a huge anxiety in a very sort of heteronormative setting. And high-risk behaviors, and this is an interesting one where people would start getting into sex work, men getting into sex work and saying, well, I'm already spoiled goods, I might as well make some money out of it. No, I think it gets even more complicated than that, but that's definitely one of the dynamics that we have seen. And then psychosocial, so withdrawal as a psychological thing, but withdrawing from the whole family. So survivors just unable to interact with their own kids, often because they're feeling they don't want to project their anger onto their own children. So rather than engage with the kids and risk blowing up, they just withdraw. Exclusion and expulsion from the community, being unable to work. I mean, if you have some of these physical consequences, like a rectal prolapse, you're definitely not going to go out and do physical labor. And if you're incontinent, and so on. Impoverishment because you can't work, then you can't provide for your family, and again, in a sort of very traditional setting, that's what you're supposed to do as a man, but you can't do it anymore. So your whole sense of who you are as a man is now in crisis. Crisis of masculinity, and then you get the domestic violence, and you know, it's not that all the male victims suddenly become perpetrators of partner violence. It's also their own families start to perpetrate violence against them because they're failing in what they're supposed to do or expected to do as men. They're not putting food on the table, they're not paying school fees, they can't pay the rent, and so on. And so you get a lot of domestic violence issues. And then the political, which is a sort of later outcome in terms of a lot of passive resistance, reinforcement of these various divisions, ethnic, religious, national, and ultimately perpetuating cycles of violence. So I have come across cases where male victims, you know, they recover physically and they go and join an armed group at the next possible opportunity to see what they can do in turn. So I want to very quickly take you sort of through the thought process, how the thought process have changed for myself. As I said, when we first started on this, the focus was on the sexual violence as an act. And if you look at if you remember the definitions, it's all about acts. We also started off very much with each survivor as an individual, and not looking beyond that individual. Totally inadequate and incomplete data because people were not telling their stories, so there just wasn't any data. And then that was being used to justify no interventions. So let me not name any organizations, some of them have been flagged already this morning. But organizations saying, well, you know, there's nothing to engage with. There's no data. We have women reporting, so we need to put our money where the reports are coming from. So policy and practice, very inadequate, very compromised, and all the work focused on individuals.
Quick question on this.
Sure.
So you showed us how Uganda sees it, you showed us how the Rome Statute is done. How does the UN see it? Because they have authority of implementation in many countries.
Yeah.
Do they approach this at all? Do they have like some sort of own definition or own process of looking at stuff like this, or is it completely blindsided?
It's not completely. It's not totally. It's on the agenda somehow a little bit. In 2012, UNHCR actually asked me to write guidelines on how to work with survivors, which, you know, I would write them differently now, but that is a published document. If they have guidelines for working with LGBTI, all these different lists. So anyway, we did that one. But I mean, I can also tell you that even if you go to any UNHCR operation in any of the different settlements, hardly anybody will have seen that, and hardly anybody will have had any training. And I can see you nodding. I mean, it's there so they can say, yeah, we deal with it. We've even got guidelines, but there is no training. It does not
Not compute.
So
It does not compute.
doesn't compute, doesn't filter down, and you know, if you look at they call it the GBV IMS, Information Management System, you're not this awful kind of attempt to gather data from everywhere. There are no cases of men at all. They just don't, it just doesn't register. So that's UNHCR, which is kind of an important, should be a really central. You have the Office of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence and Conflict. That was established in 2010. And I've worked quite a bit with them to try and push it up their agenda.
Can I ask a question? What about youth? I'm just wondering, maybe some of them are caught in like the youth.
That would be sent to UNICEF and all of
No,
that.
I'm saying that it's kind of categorized as violence against youth, and then they're put into this kind of folder category of youth violence and not categorized as men.
Where do you draw the line?
What?
At what point is youth and
That's
It's
exactly
very,
what I'm
very
saying, because
difficult,
in many
yeah.
contexts, it's up to age 35, and I'm
Yeah.
guessing it's. I just wonder, maybe some of it is part because it's a man, you can't talk about it, and it's a man, you won't. I'm just. Because there's a problem with UNHCR about categories, right? So, as we know, so as not the minute they're categorized as something as youth, it might be completely missing from certain discussions. And
Well, it might
I
be,
think it's
but
on purpose, right? I'm not saying it's an accident, but I'm
Yeah.
saying it might be just also.
I'm not aware of UNICEF doing anything of any interest. I mean, I've never come across anything that they've done. That office I was talking about, Special Representative of the Secretary General, Sexual Violence and Conflict, they have done quite a. We held a workshop in 2014 specifically on this topic. They've started to mention it in the representatives' reports, like a paragraph here and there. But I think they tend to kind of relapse quite easily into sexual violence is rape, and rape is women. So you know, they have a kind of, they're not stable, let me say, in the advocacy around this. So those are the two sort of big ones that I would think about immediately in terms of the UN. IOM has some awareness, particularly in terms of trafficking in persons, and the fact that there is trafficking in men and boys for sexual purposes, and then there's also all sorts of sexual violence that happens on the trafficking routes. Again, it's a little bit under-attended to.
nothing from the High Commissioner for Human Rights or one of the committees or treaty bodies on that subject? It seems like
Very little. I mean, you'll get, of course, you have the UN Security Council resolutions, which since 1325 in 2000, I think there's been about 8 that build on 1325, which is about women, peace and security. And the last two have mentioned men and boys somewhere, but often sort of on page 8 of a 9-page resolution, you'll find a little line about men and boys. But it was, I think the first one was, I've forgotten which one it was, the year, but it was around 2016, I think. It was very late. It took an awful long time. As I say, by sort of 2015, we were starting to look at different ways of screening to try and identify more systematically. And we were able to do that at scale, and that's where the statistics that I briefly showed you come from. So where we started to screen, we'd screened about 15,000 people by the time I got those figures. But the development of effective policy and practice still severely compromised. British government just about 2 weeks ago had its Prevention of Sexual Violence Initiative conference for the second time. The first time was 2014. And there were virtually no discussions about male victims of sexual violence. So it was kind of almost worse than 2014. I think where I'm at now is really going from sexual violence and act to sexual violence, the actors, or sexual violence as an entire landscape in which acts are only a small part of the whole. rather than survivors as individuals, looking at survivors as multiple, interconnected, differently exposed. We've already mentioned it, flagged some of it. The witnessing is a very massive exposure. If you witness your mother being gang raped at the age of 8, you almost, many people I know personally have become alcoholics by the time they're 35. You know, I mean, there's the way it translates over time is pretty substantial. Only some of the victims are victims of visibly sexual acts. So even rape, if it's rape with an object, you know, is it sexual in the sense that we think about sex? For some people it may be, but for others it won't be. It's much more instrumental in terms of the humiliation target of the target and so on. Trying to get away from rape as being synonymous with sexual violence, and I think we're getting somewhere with that. But as I say, big people at the top of the scale keep lapsing back into seeing them as synonymous. Still inadequate policy and practice. But what we've been able to do, and at Refugee Law Project we worked quite hard at this, was sort of shifting away from just the individual who first presents to us to trying to see who else is around this individual and how do we access them in a way that is ethical and, you know, that is appropriate. So one of the big issues that we found, especially with Congolese actually, was that we'd end up working with a man and we'd end up working with a woman and then realize that they're actually husband and wife, and also realize that they don't know each other's own status in terms of experiences or exposure to sexual violence. And we've been working with these two individuals, both of them as victims of sexual violence, and they don't know it. And they're having a horrible life together at home. We talked about the psychological and psychosexual impacts. All of those playing out on a massive scale. Nobody wants to touch each other, and they're wondering what's going on, and they're too scared to talk to each other. And then you end up knowing both of them and knowing that they're connected and they're talking about these problems. And then you have to find a way, like, can we bridge the two? Can we connect them? And sometimes it works. Some people will just say no, 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 no. But quite often it does actually work out, and then and that's where you can sort of begin a recovery process. Because if you only work with one of them and the other one's still in their own space, not knowing what's happened, knowing what happened to them but not to their partner, then that partner's never going to recover properly. So sort of seeing that the recovery is actually they're interdependent, and you can't help one person to get fixed if you're ignoring the people around them. And that's not just about, you know, what happens in the bedroom, but also what happens with children, and how as a parent you deal with children who maybe have been exposed to what happened, who are traumatized, they're acting out in all sorts of different spaces. You know, that needs a very particular and intentional kind of intervention.